The mind does something peculiar at 53. It begins counting backwards, tallying what wasn't done rather than celebrating what was. Hannah discovered this truth while standing in her empty office at 11:47 p.m., watching city lights blur through tears she hadn't expected. 28 years at the same company, and tomorrow she would hand in her resignation letter, not because she was brave, but because staying had become more terrifying than leaving. You know this feeling, don't you? That peculiar ache that visits in the quiet hours, when the day's distractions fade and you're left alone with the weight of unlived dreams. It arrives not as sharp pain, but as a dull recognition the career you built wasn't the life you imagined. The choices you made weren't really choices at all, just reactions to fear dressed up as responsibility. 5 years ago, when my husband passed, I understood something about regret that all my Buddhist training hadn't quite reached. We spend so much time preparing for death, yet we rarely prepare for the harder task, living fully while we still can. The Buddha spoke often about impermanence, but until you feel it in your bones, until you realize that someday is a luxury you can no longer afford, the teaching remains merely philosophical. Tonight, I want to share something different. Not another meditation on letting go, but a story about letting begin. About what happens when we stop asking, "What if I fail?" and start asking, "What if I've already succeeded at the wrong thing?" This shift, subtle as moonlight on water, can transform those midnight hours of regret into dawn's first light of possibility. Hannah's story begins where many midlife tales do, in the space between who we've become and who we still might be. She had built what everyone called success. Corner office, 6-figure salary, respect in her field. Yet standing there among her achievements, she felt like an actor who'd perfected someone else's role. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, but tonight they sounded like a countdown she could no longer ignore. Her phone buzzed, a text from her daughter. "Mom, saw your light on. You okay? How do you explain to your child that you're mourning a life you never lived? That success can feel like failure when it's built on foundations of fear." Hannah typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, "Just thinking. Love you." The resignation letter sat on her desk, its crisp white surface reflecting the overhead lights. She'd written it 3 times over the past month, each version more honest than the last. The first spoke of new opportunities. The second mentioned personal growth. But this final version told the truth. I need to remember who I was before I became afraid. At 53, Hannah was contemplating what most would call career suicide. She wanted to leave corporate marketing to become a potter, to trade PowerPoints for clay, strategy meetings for the meditation of the wheel. Her savings could sustain her for 18 months, maybe 2 years if she was careful. But the math wasn't what kept her awake at night. It was the voice that whispered, "You're too old to start over, too invested to change course, too visible to fail." That voice had governed her choices for decades. It had told her to take the safe job after college, to marry the reliable man her parents approved of, to stay in a marriage that had ended long before the divorce papers were signed. It had shaped her into someone successful, stable, and utterly disconnected from her own desires. But tonight, something was shifting. As she stood in that sterile office, Hannah remembered a story her grandmother had told her about lotus flowers. "They grow through mud," her grandmother had said, hands covered in garden soil. "The deeper the mud, the stronger they must push to reach the light." But look, she'd pointed to the blooms floating serenely on the pond's surface. Not a trace of dirt on those petals. They transform the darkness they grow through. The memory arrived with such clarity that Hannah could smell her grandmother's garden, feel the sun on her 8-year-old shoulders. When had she stopped believing in transformation? When had she accepted that mud was permanent, that staying stuck was somehow noble? She walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Below, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm: taxis hunting for fares, late-night joggers defying exhaustion, office cleaners beginning their invisible labor. Everyone in motion, everyone playing their part in the great dance of doing. But what about being? What about the life that happens between achievements, in the spaces where we remember how to breathe? 28 years, the number felt heavier than her. Body, denser than the desk that had been her anchor and her cage. She'd climbed every ladder placed before her, exceeded every expectation except her own. The promotions had come regularly, each one feeling less like victory and more like verdict. Another link in a chain she'd forged herself. Her reflection in the window showed a woman she barely recognized. When had her shoulders begun carrying so much tension? When had her smile become something she scheduled rather than something that simply arose? The fluorescent lights turned her skin ghostly, and for a moment she saw herself as she truly was. A specter haunting someone else's life. The lotus beneath the moon. The phrase returned unbidden, carrying the weight of teaching she'd heard, but never truly absorbed. In Buddhism, the lotus represents the possibility of beauty emerging from difficulty, of purity arising from mud. But there was something else her grandmother hadn't mentioned. Something Hannah only now understood. The lotus must first accept it lives in mud. It doesn't deny its circumstances or wish for cleaner water. It simply begins where it is and grows toward what calls it. Hannah's mud was specific and familiar. It was the morning meetings where she sold products she didn't believe in. It was the networking events where she performed confidence while feeling hollow. It was the steady accumulation of achievements that impressed others while leaving her empty. But mostly, it was the fear that had governed every major decision: fear of disappointment, fear of judgment, fear of discovering that her dreams might be as fragile as unfired clay. She thought of the pottery studio she passed every morning on her commute. Through its windows, she'd glimpsed people bent over wheels, hands covered in slip, faces focused with the kind of concentration she remembered from childhood. There was something about clay that had always called to her: its willingness to become, its patience with imperfection, its promise that what breaks can be remade. At 18, she'd wanted to study ceramics. Her parents had steered her toward business. "Art is a lovely hobby," her mother had said, "but you need something practical." Practical. The word had shaped 3 decades of choices, each one moving her further from the girl who used to spend hours by the pond, watching light dance on water, dreaming of creating beauty with her own hands. The resignation letter waited. Hannah picked it up, feeling its weight negligible in ounces, enormous in implication. This piece of paper represented more than leaving a job. It was an admission that the life she'd built was a beautiful prison, that success without satisfaction was its own form of failure. Her phone buzzed again. This time, an email from a client praising her latest campaign. "Brilliant work, Hannah. You really understand what sells." She almost laughed at the irony. Yes, she understood what sold. She'd been selling herself short for so long, she'd become an expert at packaging limitation as wisdom, fear as prudence. But understanding what sells isn't the same as understanding what sustains. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment, but he also taught something more subtle. That sometimes we must attach to our truest desires before we can release our false ones. We must claim our authentic path before we can let go of the inauthentic one we've been walking. Hannah returned to her desk, but instead of sitting in her ergonomic chair, she sat on the floor. The carpet was industrial, designed to withstand years of traffic without showing wear, like her, like the persona she'd crafted to survive corporate life. Durable, practical, utterly without poetry. From this new perspective, her office looked different. The awards on the wall seemed like museum pieces from someone else's life. The strategic plans she'd crafted with such precision appeared as what they were: maps to destinations she no longer wished to reach. Even the view from her corner office, once a symbol of arrival, now felt like a daily reminder of elevation without elevation, of climbing without ascending. She closed her eyes and tried something she hadn't done in years. She listened to her body. Beneath the familiar tension, beneath the habitual bracing against the next demand, something else stirred. It felt like spring water moving beneath ice, like life insisting despite all efforts to contain it. Her breathing deepened naturally, finding a rhythm she'd forgotten she knew. In meditation, they teach you to notice the pause between breaths, that moment of suspension where nothing is required, where being is enough. Hannah found that pause now, and in it she heard her truth. Staying would be the real failure. Staying would be choosing death while still alive. The Buddha's teaching came to her not as words, but as understanding. Each moment contains the possibility of birth, not rebirth in some distant life, but birth right here, in this fluorescent-lit office, in this 53-year-old body, in this heart that had finally grown tired of pretending. She thought of the lotus again, but differently this time. The lotus doesn't emerge from mud despite the mud, it emerges because of it. The mud provides nutrients, anchor, the very resistance that makes rising meaningful. Her years in corporate life, her accumulated fears, her catalog of regrets, these weren't obstacles to transformation. They were its raw material. Hannah stood, her decision crystallizing like glaze in a kiln's heat. Tomorrow, she would submit the letter. Tomorrow, she would begin the terrifying, exhilarating process of becoming who she'd always been beneath the performance. But tonight, in this moment suspended between what was and what might be, she did something simpler. She accepted the mud. The acceptance felt like a release and an embrace simultaneously. Yes, she had spent decades building the wrong life. Yes, she had chosen safety over authenticity. Yes, she was starting over at an age when others were consolidating their gains. And yes, emphatically, yes, it was exactly the right time. Because the Lotus teaches patience alongside transformation. It knows that emerging happens in its own time, that beauty cannot be rushed, that the journey from mud to blossom is itself the point. Hannah had spent 28 years in preparation, though she hadn't known it. Every compromise had taught her what she didn't want. Every achievement had shown her what wasn't enough. Every moment of quiet desperation had been nudging her toward this recognition. It's never too late to bloom. The thought of the pottery studio returned, but now it carried texture, possibility. She could feel the clay between her fingers, cool and responsive. She could smell the earthiness of the studio, hear the gentle hum of wheels spinning. But more than these sensory promises, she could feel the alignment, that rare sensation when inner desire meets outer action, when who you are finally matches what you do. This is what Buddhism calls right livelihood, though the teaching is often misunderstood. It's not about finding perfect work or sacred occupation. It's about bringing your whole self to whatever you do, about refusing to split between who you are and how you survive. For some, right livelihood means staying in corporate life, but transforming their relationship to it. For Hannah, it meant leaving entirely, choosing uncertainty over unconsciousness. The city lights continued their dance beyond her window, but now they seemed less like judgment and more like celebration. All those lights represented people in motion, people choosing, people becoming. She was joining an ancient procession of those who decided that authentic failure was preferable to inauthentic success. Her phone buzzed once more. Her daughter again. "Mom, I'm proud of you. Whatever you're thinking about up there, I hope you choose yourself for once." Hannah smiled, a real smile that started in her belly and radiated outward. How did children know? How did they see through all the careful constructions to the truth beneath? She typed back, "I am. Finally. See you for coffee tomorrow?" The resignation letter no longer seemed like an ending, but a beginning. 28 years of preparation for this moment of clarity. 28 years of gathering courage disguised as compromise. 28 years of mud, nurturing a lotus that was finally ready to rise. She placed the letter in her bag, turned off the lights, and prepared to leave. But first, she stood in the darkness, feeling the space she'd inhabited for so long. Tomorrow it would belong to someone else, someone who might find it perfect for their journey. But for her, it had become too small, too defined, too distant from dirt and clay and the honest work of hands creating beauty. The elevator descended with its usual efficiency, carrying her from the 23rd floor to the lobby. But Hannah felt as if she were rising, as if each floor released another weight she'd been carrying. By the time she reached the street, she felt almost buoyant, ready to float like that lotus on uncertain waters. The night air carried promise. Somewhere in this city, clay waited to be shaped. Somewhere, a wheel sat ready to spin. Somewhere, her real life was preparing to begin, patient as a seed that knows its season has finally come. This is what midlife revelation feels like. Not a crisis, but a recognition. Not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. The regrets don't disappear, they transform into teachers. The lost purpose isn't. Found, it's created fresh, from the materials at hand, from the mud we've been given. Hannah walked toward her car, each step feeling more solid than the last. The fear was still there, of course it was. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of discovering she'd waited too long. But now the fear had company. Hope had entered the conversation, bringing its friend Courage, who brought along their cousin Joy. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The savings might run out. The pottery might not sell. Friends might whisper about midlife crisis and reckless choices. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Hannah had remembered a fundamental truth. We are not our fears, our roles, or our accumulated compromises. We are the consciousness that can choose differently, the awareness that can say enough and mean it. As the night deepens, another voice joins our circle. The spreadsheet glowed at 3:17 a.m., its cells filled with projections that meant nothing when sleep refused to come. Marcus had been running these numbers for 23 years, first as an analyst at Goldman, then through his own hedge fund, and now as CFO of a tech startup that promised to revolutionize something he'd stopped believing in months ago. The formulas were perfect. His life was not. I understand this particular exhaustion because I lived it for 37 years, until the morning I found myself calculating the ROI of my own happiness and coming up short. That was the day everything changed, though change, as I learned, comes slowly for those of us trained to make split-second trades. Marcus closes his laptop and walks to the window of his Tribeca loft. Below, the city that never sleeps mirrors his own restlessness. His phone buzzes, a text from his teenage daughter asking for help with calculus at this ungodly hour. She can't sleep either. His wife's light is on in their bedroom down the hall. The house hums with shared insomnia, each family member isolated in their private struggle with the night. In my corner office on the 42nd floor, I used to watch the sunrise paint Manhattan gold while finishing my third espresso. Success looked like this: arriving before dawn, leaving after dark, measuring worth in basis points and market share. Until the morning, my assistant found me passed out on my desk, clutching a bottle of Xanax like a lifeline. Marcus pads to the kitchen, avoiding the creaky floorboard that might wake his younger son. The refrigerator light illuminates yesterday's takeout containers, evidence of another family dinner sacrificed to conference calls. He remembers his own father's absences, justified by providing. The cycle continues, refined and repackaged for a new generation. The Buddha's story offers a different calculus. When Prince Siddhartha left his palace, he wasn't escaping luxury. He was escaping the illusion that luxury could solve suffering. I learned this distinction the hard way, sitting in a monastery in Kyoto, still checking my phone for market updates every 10 minutes. The teacher, an elderly woman who'd once been a Tokyo executive herself, simply smiled and said, "Your portfolio is diversified everywhere except where it matters most." Marcus's home office door is slightly open. Inside, the meditation cushion his wife bought him for Christmas sits unused, still wrapped in plastic. Beside it, a book on mindfulness for executives, its spine uncracked. These aspirational purchases mock him gently, reminders of intentions deferred by urgency. The house fills with sounds that aren't quite silence. The dishwasher's hum, a car passing outside, his daughter's music playing softly through her door. His wife appears in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in the cashmere robe he gave her last anniversary. They look at each other across the granite island, two successful people who've forgotten how to rest. "Can't sleep either?" she asks, though the answer is obvious. "Board meeting tomorrow?" Marcus says, though that's not really why. She nods, understanding the code. In executive marriages, We speak in shorthand about pressures too complex to fully articulate. She makes tea while he stands there, remembering when they used to talk until dawn because they wanted to, not because anxiety held them hostage. The Buddha, surrounded by followers seeking wisdom, would often simply sit in silence. Not the tense silence of avoidance, but the full silence of presence. He understood something I learned only after my second heart episode. Noise isn't always audible. The loudest cacophony often happens between our ears, in the boardroom of the mind, where every thought demands immediate action. Marcus's phone buzzes again. A notification from Hong Kong. The markets are opening. His thumb hovers over the app, muscle memory, pulling him toward charts and positions. But something makes him pause. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's the way his wife's shoulders slump as she waits for the kettle. Maybe it's remembering his promise to his son about tomorrow's soccer game, a promise that feels as fragile as his quarterly projections. I discovered meditation not in a moment of spiritual awakening, but in a hospital bed, tethered to monitors that tracked my vital signs with the same precision I'd once applied to derivatives. The cardiologist, a woman who'd seen too many executives in their 40s with my exact symptoms, prescribed meditation alongside beta blockers. Think of it as risk management for your nervous system, she said, speaking my language. The kettle whistles, a sound that cuts through the apartment's white noise. Marcus's wife pours 2 cups, the ritual familiar yet strange at this hour. They sit at the kitchen table, the one they'd bought to host dinner parties that never materialized, and the silence between them shifts slightly. His daughter appears in the doorway, calculus textbook in hand, shadows under her eyes that mirror his own. "Can't figure out this limit problem," she says, and Marcus recognizes the real question underneath. Why are we all awake? Why can't we turn off? The limit problem becomes a family gathering. His wife makes more tea. His son, awakened by voices, joins them, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Here they are, the successful family in their successful home, united by their inability to find peace in the dark. This is where the Buddha's simple instruction becomes profound. He didn't say to eliminate the noise, the demands, the pressures, the endless notifications of modern life. He suggested something more radical, changing our relationship to the noise. When crowds pressed around him, shouting questions and seeking answers, he would close his eyes and breathe, not to escape, but to find the eye of the storm. Marcus looks at his family around the table. His daughter's pencil scratches against paper. His wife's fingers wrap around her mug. His son yawns, leaning against his mother. The dishwasher clicks into its next cycle. These sounds, which seemed chaotic moments ago, begin to form their own rhythm. I learned this practice from a teacher who'd spent years on Wall Street before finding Dharma. You know how in trading, there's always that moment of stillness before the bell, he said. That's what we're looking for. Not the absence of activity, but the presence within it. Marcus closes his eyes, just for a moment. The apartment's sounds continue. His daughter's questions, his wife's gentle corrections, his son's sleepy observations. But something shifts. Instead of each sound demanding response, they become texture, like rain on windows or wind through leaves. The breath comes naturally, though Marcus doesn't force it. In through the nose, feeling the cool air. Out through the mouth, releasing more than carbon dioxide. His shoulders, perpetually raised toward his ears, begin to descend. The knot in his stomach, his constant companion since the startup's last funding round, loosens slightly. His daughter notices first. "Dad, you okay?" He opens his eyes to find his family watching him with concern. When was the last time he'd simply sat with them without multitasking, without his mind calculating futures while his body occupied the present? "Just breathing," he says, and the words feel foreign yet true. His wife's hand finds his across the table. Their son, still young enough to be unself-conscious, leans into his father's side. The calculus problem sits unfinished, but something else is being solved in this pre-dawn gathering. This is what the Buddha understood. Silence isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of acceptance. In my executive coaching now, I teach this to CEOs who can't sleep, to traders who dream in numbers, to consultants who've optimized everything except their own peace. The practice isn't complex. That's what makes it challenging for minds trained in complexity. Marcus guides his family through a simple exercise, one I learned in that Kyoto temple while my phone buzzed with urgent messages I was learning weren't urgent at all. "Just notice your breath," he says, feeling like an imposter but continuing anyway. "Don't change it. Just notice." The kitchen becomes a meditation hall. 4 people, each carrying their own pressures, sit in the gentlest of rebellions against the tyranny of productivity. His daughter's pencil stills. His wife's grip on her mug relaxes. His son's breathing deepens. 3 breaths. That's all. 3 conscious breaths in a kitchen at 3:47 a.m., while the city churns outside and the markets open across the globe. 3 breaths that don't solve quarterly projections or calculus problems or the mortgage payment or the college applications. 3 breaths that solve something else entirely. The Buddha said that peace comes not from the absence of chaos, but from finding stillness within it. I used to think this was spiritual bypassing, the kind of wisdom that sounds good in theory but fails in practice. Then I learned to apply it during hostile takeover negotiations, using breath as my anchor while millions hung in the balance. The deals still mattered, but they no longer owned my sleep. Marcus's family opens their eyes simultaneously, as if choreographed. Something has shifted, subtle as a decimal point, but significant as a market correction. The kitchen hasn't changed. The pressures remain. Tomorrow's board meeting still looms, but the quality of this moment has transformed. His daughter returns to her calculus, but her shoulders are lower. His wife sips her tea with something approaching pleasure. His son, drowsy again, heads back to bed with a mumbled goodnight that sounds like a blessing. Marcus sits in the afterglow of shared stillness, wondering if this is what he's been seeking in spreadsheets and projections. The practice becomes a ritual, though not immediately. Change, I've learned, comes in increments for those of us programmed for instant results. Some nights, Marcus still finds himself calculating scenarios at 3 a.m., but increasingly, he also finds himself breathing, feeling the anchor of his body in the chair, the weight of gravity holding him to a spinning planet that doesn't care about his quarterly reports. His wife begins joining him, these pre-dawn meditation sessions that start as insomnia and transform into something else. His daughter, stressed about SATs, discovers that 3 conscious breaths before a test calm her racing mind. His son, still young enough to be wise, reminds them to breathe when dinner conversations grow tense. The apartment's soundscape remains unchanged. Dishwashers and traffic, notifications and neighborly noises. But the family's relationship to these sounds evolves. What once felt like assault becomes texture. What demanded reaction receives response. The silence between sounds expands, creating space for something other than anxiety to grow. I think of my old office, that corner suite with its panoramic views of Manhattan's endless ambition. I thought I was at the summit then, having climbed every ladder placed before me. But summits, I learned, are just platforms for seeing farther. What I saw, finally, was that the view meant nothing if I couldn't breathe easily in the thin air of success. Marcus finds his meditation cushion one evening, still wrapped in its holiday plastic. He unwraps it slowly, as if performing a ritual. The cushion is nothing special, made in China, probably, sold through Amazon, delivered by someone working their own exhausting shift. But sitting on it feels like a declaration, small and private, that something matters more than optimization. The book on mindfulness for executives remains unread. Marcus discovers he doesn't need another framework, another system to master. The practice is simpler than any derivatives model. Sit, breathe, notice. When thoughts arise about tomorrow's presentation, notice. When anxiety spirals about his daughter's future, notice. When anger flares about a colleague's incompetence, notice. Noticing becomes his new algorithm, pattern recognition applied to the landscape of his own mind. He discovers his triggers, the 2:30 a.m. wake-up that signals stress, the jaw tension that precedes a difficult conversation, the shallow breathing that accompanies email overwhelm. These bodily signals, ignored for decades in favor of mental override, become his early warning system. His family notices the changes before he does. "You're different," his wife says one evening, not as accusation but observation. She's right. He still works long hours, still faces pressure, still navigates the endless demands of modern success. But something fundamental has shifted in his relationship to these challenges. The Buddha's genius wasn't in escaping the palace, but in understanding that the palace exists in our minds. Every external empire reflects an internal construction. I built my palace from stock options and status, from busy nests and belonging. Marcus built his from similar materials. The dismantling happens breath by breath, moment by moment, in kitchens at dawn and cushions at dusk. Sleep comes easier now, though not always easily. Some nights, Marcus still calculates probabilities in the dark, but increasingly, he also feels the rise and fall of his chest, the weight of blankets, the warmth of his wife beside him. These simple anchors, available to princes and paupers alike, offer refuge more reliable than any portfolio. The paradox of meditation, I've learned, is that it promises nothing and delivers everything. No ROI calculations apply. No metrics capture its value. It's the most radical investment an executive can make. Time spent doing nothing that transforms how we do everything. Marcus guides his team through a breathing exercise before their board meeting. "Just 3 breaths," he says, watching his colleagues' skepticism turn to surprise as their shoulders drop and focus sharpens. The presentation goes well, though that's not the point. The point is that 20 people discovered they could access calm in the midst of chaos. That peace isn't a luxury reserved for retreats, but a skill available in boardrooms. This is the middle path. not rejecting success, but redefining it. Not escaping pressure, but transforming our relationship to it. The Buddha found enlightenment not by eliminating desire, but by understanding its nature. We find rest not by eliminating activity, but by discovering stillness within motion. The lotus that blooms in muddy water becomes Marcus's metaphor, though he'd never say this aloud in a partner's meeting. His life remains muddy, complicated family dynamics, uncertain markets, ambitious goals that may or may not manifest. But something blooms anyway, fed by the very conditions that once seemed only burdensome. His meditation practice deepens without becoming precious. Some mornings he sits for 20 minutes, watching thoughts arise and pass like taxis in Manhattan traffic. Other days, 3 breaths at a red light are his entire practice. The form matters less than the intention, to stay present in a world designed to pull us elsewhere. I remember my last day at the firm, cleaning out that corner office while colleagues pretended not to stare. They thought I was having a breakdown, leaving Wall Street for wellness. They couldn't understand that I was having a breakthrough, that wellness wasn't an industry, but an orientation, that success without peace is the most expensive failure imaginable. Marcus won't leave his job. That's not his path. Instead, he becomes a bridge between worlds, bringing contemplative practices into competitive spaces, demonstrating that mindfulness and market share aren't mutually exclusive. His team's performance improves, though that's a side effect rather than the goal. The real transformation is harder to quantify. People sleeping better, relating deeper, stressing less while accomplishing more. The apartment at 3 a.m. tells a different story now. Sometimes Marcus still wakes, habits carved by decades of hypervigilance not easily erased. But instead of reaching immediately for his phone or laptop, he reaches first for his breath. The anchor holds. The storm passes. Sleep returns like a friend rather than an enemy. His family develops their own practices, each finding what works. His wife through yoga, his daughter through journaling, his son through soccer with newfound presence. They don't meditate together often. This isn't a Hallmark movie. But they share an understanding that peace is possible, that silence can be refuge. That breath is always available as home base in the game of modern life. The Buddha's instruction echoes through centuries to land in a Tribeca kitchen. When the world shouts, when demands multiply, when sleep eludes and anxiety floods, return to the breath. Not as escape, but as engagement. Not as withdrawal, but as the deepest form of participation. Let each breath feel like a step toward lighter thoughts, toward the recognition that we are not our thoughts, our pressures, our midnight calculations. Marcus closes his eyes now, here in the success he once thought would solve everything, and finds what was always available: the simple rhythm of inhale and exhale, the basic miracle of being alive, the profound ordinariness of this moment. The markets will open, emails will demand response, family will need attention. But first, this breath, then that breath. Building peace one inhalation at a time, constructing a fortune that no market can crash. Another story waits in the wings of our midnight gathering, a voice emerging from shadows cast by different sorrows. Angela, 41, sits in her newly empty house, the silence after divorce ringing louder than any argument ever did. Her journey toward dawn requires different medicine, though the prescription remains surprisingly similar. Presence, breath, The radical act of staying with what is, rather than fleeing toward what might be. The dream always began the same way. Footsteps on creaking floorboards, a presence just beyond sight, and that familiar weight of dread settling into my chest like a stone. But this time, as I lay in the darkness of my small, monastic room, I didn't flee from the approaching figure. 20 years of therapy practice, 10 years in robes, and still the shadow visitors came in the small hours, teaching what daylight could never reveal. Angela had come to me during my final year of practice, before I traded my therapist's chair for a meditation cushion. 41, recently divorced, she carried her aloneness like a visible wound. "I can't bear the nights," she'd whispered, gripping a tissue box like a life raft. "The house feels haunted by who I used to be." I understood. We all have our 3 a.m. visitors, those aspects of ourselves we've banished to the basement of consciousness, only to have them climb the stairs when our defenses sleep. Jung called them the shadow. Buddha named them the hungry ghosts. But Angela simply called them the terrible knowing. That first night after her husband left, she'd found herself standing before the bathroom mirror, seeing not her own face, but her mother's. The same tight mouth, the same fear-carved lines, the same eyes that had learned to look away from their own longing. "I became her," Angela said. "Everything I swore I'd never be." The shadow often wears familiar faces. In my own practice, I'd discovered that our rejected selves don't disappear. They slip into the spaces between breaths, the pause before sleep, the moment when the lantern of consciousness dims. They wait in the liminal places, patient as stones. Angela's dreams began changing when she stopped running from them. Instead of the recurring nightmare where she searched empty rooms for something she couldn't name, she started having conversations with the searcher. "Who are you looking for?" she asked one night, and the dream figure turned. It wore her face at 17, eyes bright with plans that never bloomed. In Buddhist psychology, we speak of the aggregates, the components that create our sense of self. But Jung knew something the ancient texts only hinted at. We are not just what we've assembled, but also what we've discarded. Every choice to be this means choosing not to be that, and those unchosen selves don't simply vanish. They take up residence in the unconscious, growing stronger in the dark. The memory of Angela's breakthrough still moves through me like temple bells. She'd been practicing a meditation I'd adapted from both traditions, what I called shadow breathing. Instead of following the breath with detachment, she was learning to inhale what she'd always exhaled away. On the in-breath, I welcome my mother's fear. On the out-breath, I am large enough to hold it. 3 weeks in, she arrived at our session transformed. "I had the most extraordinary dream," she began, and I knew before she spoke that something had shifted in the deep waters. I was in my childhood home, but it was also my house now. My mother was there, young, maybe my age. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and she was crying. I asked her why, and she said, "I'm so tired of being afraid." And instead of running, instead of fixing, I just sat with her. I held her hand. The shadow integration happened in that simple gesture. Not conquering the feared aspects, not analyzing them away, but offering them the compassion we'd never learned to give. Angela discovered what the monks in my tradition have always known. Genuine self-love isn't about affirming our light, but about embracing our darkness with the same tenderness we'd offer a frightened child. As autumn deepened that year, Angela's nights transformed. The empty house became a monastery of solitude, each room a different meditation hall. She began what she called her lantern practice, lighting a single candle and sitting with it, letting its glow remind her that light doesn't eliminate shadow but dances with it, creating the depth that makes a room feel alive. I realized, she told me during what would be our final session, that I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of meeting all the selves I'd abandoned along the way. But they weren't monsters. They were just tired travelers, wanting to come home. The psychological truth merged with the Dharma teaching. What we resist persists. What we befriend transforms. Angela learned to recognize her shadow not as enemy, but as teacher, each dark aspect holding a gift wrapped in fear. My own journey from therapist to nun began with a similar recognition. The competent professional I'd cultivated for decades was only one face of a many-faced crystal. In the meditation hall, other faces emerged. The child who spoke to invisible friends, the teenager who wrote poetry to the moon, the young woman who chose security over adventure. They all lived in me still, waiting in the spaces between thoughts. The night I decided to ordain, I dreamed of a vast library where all my unchosen lives were cataloged. Dream me walked the aisles, touching spine after spine. The artist I didn't become, the mother path not taken, the wanderer I caged. But instead of grief, I felt a strange completion. They were all there, safe, part of my inner mandala. Taking robes didn't mean rejecting these shadow selves, but including them in a larger wholeness. Angela's integration deepened through what Jung called active imagination. She would sit in her evening solitude and invite different aspects to tea. The bitter divorced woman, the hopeful young bride, the child who believed in forever. She served them all, listening to their stories, understanding that each held a piece of her truth. The divorced woman taught me boundaries, she explained. The bride reminded me that hope isn't foolish. The child showed me that forever exists in each moment, not in promises. The shadow work became a practice of reclamation, gathering the scattered pieces of self into a more complete constellation. This is what I learned in 20 years of sitting with human darkness. We don't heal by excising our shadows, but by learning their names. Every projection onto others, every triggered response, every 3 a.m. anxiety is a shadow aspect, knocking, asking to be seen, seeking its place in the wholeness of who we are. Angela discovered that her dread of nighttime solitude was actually a fear of meeting her own depths. But depths, as any swimmer knows, hold treasures that surface waters can't sustain. In the quiet hours, she found not emptiness, but richness. All the selves she'd been, might have been, and was still becoming. The Buddhist teaching merged with depth psychology in her practice. The concept of anatta, non-self, didn't mean she had no self, but that she wasn't limited to any single version. Like light through a prism, she could be many colors simultaneously, each valid, each part of the whole spectrum. My teacher once said that meditation isn't about finding peace, but about making peace. With thoughts, feelings, sensations, and yes, with the shadow figures that populate our inner landscape. Angela embodied this teaching, transforming her haunted house into a temple where all aspects were welcome. The dream work continued evolving. Where once she dreaded sleep, She now approached it as an opportunity for integration. Last night, she shared in one of our phone conversations, "I dreamed I was hosting a party. All my ages were there. 7-year-old me was playing with 17-year-old me. 30-year-old me was laughing with who I am now. And standing in the corner, smiling, was an old woman I haven't become yet." She raised her glass to me and said, "Thank you for making room." This is the gift of shadow work, discovering that our inner landscape is vast enough to hold contradictions, failures, fears, and forgotten dreams without being diminished. In fact, we're enlarged by the inclusion, made more whole by accepting our holes. The monastic path offered a container for this work to deepen. In the silence of meditation, shadows rise like mist from morning valleys. But instead of disturbing the peace, they become part of it. The necessary darkness that gives meaning to light. The fertile void from which compassion grows. Angela's lantern practice evolved into something beautiful. She would light her candle and speak to the flame. "This light is for the me who feels scared. This warmth is for the me who feels angry. This glow is for all the parts learning to be whole." The ritual became a nightly integration, a gentle gathering of scattered selves. The therapeutic insight that changed my practice was recognizing that symptoms are often shadow messengers. Angela's insomnia wasn't just about being alone. It was about avoiding the crowd of selves waiting in the dark. Her anxiety wasn't just fear. It was the energy of suppressed aspects seeking expression. Working with dreams from both traditions created a unique alchemy. Jung's approach honored the personal unconscious, while Buddhist psychology pointed toward the transpersonal. Dreams became bridges between who we think we are and who we truly encompass. Personal stories opening into universal patterns. I remember the session when Angela first laughed about her shadow. "I met my inner critic in a dream last night," she said, eyes sparkling. She was wearing my mother's housecoat and carrying a clipboard. I asked her what she was writing, and she showed me. It was a list of all my faults. But when I looked closer, I realized she'd been writing the same 3 things over and over for 40 years. I said, "Aren't you tired of this?" And she just collapsed into tears. The compassion in that moment, for the inner critic, for her mother, for herself, marked a profound shift. Shadow work isn't about defeating our dark aspects, but about understanding their function, their protection, their twisted love. My own ordination ceremony took place at dawn, the sky painted with that particular light that is neither night nor day. As I knelt to receive my robes, I felt all my selves present, therapist and seeker, skeptic and believer, the one who analyzes and the one who simply knows. They all took vows that morning, all stepped into the tradition together. Angela's journey reminds us that midlife doesn't have to be about crisis, but about integration. The regrets and lost purposes that haunt our middle years are often shadow gold. Unlived lives asking not to be mourned, but to be included in who we're still becoming. She transformed her nights through a practice I now teach called shadow dialogue. Before sleep, she would ask, "What wants to be seen tonight?" Then she'd listen, not with her analytical mind, but with what Jung called the feeling function. That deep knowing that recognizes truth by its resonance, not its logic. The answers came in various forms. Sometimes a memory would surface. The day she chose security over passion. The moment she silenced her truth to keep peace. Other times, a sensation. Tightness in her throat where words got swallowed. Heaviness in her chest where dreams were buried. She learned to breathe into these places, offering space instead of resistance. My body, she realized, has been holding my shadow for 40 years. Every ache is an unlived life. Every tension a truth untold. The somatic component of shadow work became central to her practice. She would lie in bed, scanning her body not for relaxation, but for recognition. Where did the disowned selves live in her tissues? This marriage of psychological insight and contemplative practice offers a unique healing path. We're not just observing thoughts or following breath. We're actively engaging with the multiplicity of our being, offering refuge to all our refugees. The Buddhist concept of Buddha nature suggests we all have an awakened essence. Jung's idea of the self points toward an organizing center that includes both conscious and unconscious. Angela discovered these weren't different teachings, but complementary views of wholeness. The light that includes its own shadow. The peace that embraces its own conflict. Her ex-husband called one evening, wanting to reconcile. The strange thing, she told me later, was that I could feel all my selves responding differently. The wounded one wanted revenge. The lonely one wanted comfort. The wise one saw his suffering too. I didn't have to choose between them. I just listened to the chorus and then spoke from the conductor's position, with all voices included, but none dominating. She chose not to reconcile, but the decision came from integration rather than reaction. I realized I'd been so afraid of being alone because I thought it meant being incomplete. But solitude showed me I'm already whole, a whole that includes brokenness, a fullness that has room for emptiness. The shadow teachings reveal that our darkest moments often carry our greatest gifts. Angela's divorce forced her to meet aspects of herself that marriage had allowed her to project onto her partner. The abandonment she feared had already happened. She'd abandoned parts of herself for decades. The divorce simply made it visible. In my own practice, I've found that the shadow speaks most clearly in the liminal spaces, between sleep and waking, between exhale and inhale, between one thought and the next. These gaps in our usual consciousness are where the exiled selves slip through, bringing messages from the depths. Angela developed her own ritual for these threshold moments. She would pause at doorways, recognizing them as symbols of transition, and ask, "What am I leaving behind? What am I moving toward? What shadows dance at this threshold?" The practice turned her home into a temple of integration, each passage an opportunity for wholeness. The depth psychology perspective transforms our understanding of spiritual bypassing. We can't transcend what we haven't included. Angela learned that her spiritual seeking had sometimes been an escape from psychological work, just as her therapy had sometimes avoided the mystery that meditation embraces. The integration of both paths offered a more complete healing. I used to think enlightenment meant having no shadows, she reflected. Now I understand it might mean being friends with them all. This shift from elimination to integration marks the maturation of both psychological and spiritual work. My teacher often spoke of the middle way, not as compromise, but as inclusion. Angela embodied this teaching, finding the center that could hold her extremes. The desperate clinging and the cold withdrawal, the naive hope and the bitter cynicism, all were welcomed to the table of self. The recurring dream changed again as her practice deepened. Instead of searching empty rooms, she found herself in a house where every room was full of different versions of herself, all coexisting peacefully. "It's like a boarding house for all my selves," she laughed. "Sometimes they argue, sometimes they party, but they're all under one roof." This image captures the essence of shadow integration, not unity through sameness, but harmony through inclusion. The psychological work provides the understanding, the spiritual practice offers the container, and together they create space for all we are. As my own years in robes accumulate, I see how the therapist's training prepared me for monastic life in unexpected ways. The ability to hold space for others' shadows taught me to hold space for my own. The clinical distance became contemplative spaciousness. The therapeutic hour transformed into meditation sessions, where I meet my own client selves with professional compassion. Angela's journey illuminates a truth both traditions share. Healing happens through relationship, whether with a therapist, a teacher, or the multiple selves within. She learned to be her own therapist, her own teacher, offering herself the attention and acceptance she'd sought elsewhere. The lantern in her practice became a powerful symbol. Light doesn't eliminate darkness, she discovered. It reveals what darkness holds. Her nightly ritual evolved into a celebration of shadows, recognizing them as the source of depth, dimension, and ultimate meaning in her life. This understanding transforms our approach to symptoms. Angela's midlife crisis wasn't a problem to solve, but an initiation to undergo. Her lost purpose wasn't lost at all. It was multiplying, showing her that purpose itself could be plural, seasonal, evolving. The integration of Jungian and Buddhist approaches offers a unique wisdom. We are both the process and the goal, both the seeker and what's sought. Angela found that her shadows weren't obstacles to awakening, but vehicles for it. Each dark aspect carrying its own form of illumination. As she approached the anniversary of her divorce, Angela reflected on the journey. "I thought I was losing everything," she said. "But I was actually finding all the selves I'd lost along the way." The divorce wasn't an ending, but an unveiling. The shadow work continues, of course. Integration isn't a destination, but a practice, a daily welcoming of what we'd rather refuse. But Angela discovered what mystics and psychologists both know. The treasure is in the darkness, the healing in the wound, the wholeness in the acceptance of our holes. Her bedtime practice now includes what she calls shadow gratitude. "Thank you, anger, for showing me my boundaries. Thank you, sadness, for revealing my depth. Thank you, fear, for protecting what matters." Each shadow aspect, recognized and appreciated, transforms from tormentor to teacher. The depth perspective reminds us that individuation, becoming who we truly are, requires descent before ascent. Angela's dark night of divorce led not to breakdown, but to breakthrough. Not to isolation, but to a richer solitude where all her selves could finally coexist. My own path from couch to cushion taught me that psychological work and spiritual practice need each other. Psychology without spirituality can become endless analysis. Spirituality without psychology can become escapist fantasy. Together, they offer a complete path, grounded transcendence, embodied awakening. Angela's story continues teaching me. Recently, she sent a photo of her meditation space, the single lantern now accompanied by several smaller candles. One for each self I've reclaimed, she explained. The light they cast together creates intricate shadow patterns on the walls, a dancing mandala of light and dark. This is perhaps the deepest teaching. Wholeness includes partiality. The smell of jasmine tea at 2 a.m. meant Grandma couldn't sleep either. I'd find her in the kitchen, prayer beads clicking softly against the worn wooden table where 3 generations had shared their worries. She'd look up with those eyes that had seen too much. War, immigration, the death of the old ways, and pat the chair beside her. "Cannot sleep again, my heart?" she'd ask in her musical English, the words shaped by a tongue that dreamed in Mandarin. David knows this kitchen intimacy now, 56 years old and sitting at his own table at 2 a.m. Though his tea is chamomile and his worries are spreadsheets and retirement accounts instead of survival and new languages. The regrets pile up like dishes in the sink. The promotion he didn't take, the marriage that crumbled, the father he never quite became. Each night, they replay in perfect clarity, a highlight reel of roads not taken. His grandmother would have recognized this pattern. She called it hungry ghost mind, always eating the past, never satisfied. In her broken, beautiful English, she'd explained how some spirits couldn't move on because they kept trying to change what was already done. Like trying to uncook rice, she'd say, stirring her tea counterclockwise, always counterclockwise, to unwind the day. The memory pulls David back to being 8 years old, unable to sleep after breaking his mother's favorite vase. Grandma had taken him to the creek behind their house, the one that ran all the way to the ocean, she claimed, though he'd never verified this. She'd handed him a smooth pebble. "This stone is your worry," she said. "Heavy, yes? Now watch." She'd tossed her own pebble into the water, and they'd watched it disappear into the current. "Stream doesn't keep the stone," she explained. "Just carries it away. Your mind can be like stream too." She'd taught him to breathe with the water's rhythm, to feel thoughts flowing through without sticking. It wasn't Buddhist philosophy then, just Grandma's way. Though years later he'd recognize it in every meditation manual he'd read. Tonight, David finds himself walking to his backyard, where a small fountain bubbles in the corner, his attempt to recreate that childhood creek. The sound isn't quite right, too manufactured, but it carries something of the teaching. He sits on the cold ground, feeling foolish and ancient at the same time, holding not a pebble but his phone, screen dark, full of unread emails and missed opportunities. His daughter had called earlier, voice tight with her own inherited anxiety. "I can't stop thinking about Mom," she'd said, meaning David's ex-wife, her mother, who'd left them both for a job in Singapore. The pattern continues, he realizes. This inability to release, passed down like eye color or the shape of hands. His grandmother had fled China, his mother had fled tradition, his wife had fled their life together. Everyone running from or towards something, but never quite arriving at peace. The fountain gurgles, and David remembers more of Grandma's words, how she'd mixed Buddhist concepts with kitchen wisdom. "You make soup," she'd say. "You don't keep adding yesterday's vegetables. Fresh ingredients each day." She'd never called it mindfulness or presence. Those words came later, in his desperate midlife search for what she'd always known. He thinks of the formal meditation retreats he's attended, the apps on his phone, the expensive cushions and singing bowls, all trying to capture what Grandma offered freely at that creek. She'd learned from her own grandmother in a village whose name was lost to revolution, a woman who'd probably learned from her grandmother, wisdom flowing back through generations like that eternal stream. "Pebble in the stream," she'd called the practice, though he'd later learned similar teachings existed in every Buddhist tradition. But Grandma's version was specific to their family, shaped by loss and displacement, sweetened by survival. She'd toss pebbles for the family left behind, for the language her children were forgetting, for the home that existed now only in memory. And the stream took them all, patient and eternal. David feels the weight of his phone, this modern pebble containing all his digital regrets, the emails to his daughter he should have sent, the calls to his aging mother he keeps postponing, the dating profile he can't bring himself to complete. Each app a small stone of possibility and disappointment. His grandmother had adapted too, he remembers. She'd blessed his first computer, burning incense over the keyboard, mixing old ways with new necessities. "Different tools, same mind," she'd said. "Stream flows through circuits too." He'd thought she was being quaint then, but now wonders if she understood something about adaptation he's still learning. The water in his fountain recirculates, unlike that wild creek, but perhaps that's its own teaching. The same water, transformed each time it passes through. His regrets cycle too, but maybe they don't have to remain unchanged. David powers on his phone, opens his daughter's message. Instead of the usual quick response, he types, "Want to hear a story about your great-grandmother?" She responds immediately. 2 a.m. insomnia, apparently genetic. And he tells her about the creek, the pebbles, the woman who crossed an ocean carrying Buddhism in her bones rather than books. His daughter, raised on meditation apps and yoga studios, has never heard these stories. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asks. Why indeed? Perhaps because he'd been ashamed of Grandma's imperfect English, her folk Buddhism that didn't match the clean Western versions. Perhaps because he'd wanted to forget the poverty and struggle that necessitated such creative adaptations. Or perhaps because the deepest teachings only emerge when we're ready to receive them. At 2 a.m., exhausted by our own mental loops. David shares more stories. How Grandma meditated while cooking, stirring intentions into soup. How she'd count breaths on her fingers because prayer beads drew stares on the factory floor. How she'd transformed every American obstacle into a Dharma lesson, teaching impermanence through Thanksgiving leftovers and non-attachment through garage sales. His daughter laughs, then grows quiet. "I do that," she admits. "The overthinking, the replaying. Mom says I get it from you." The pattern acknowledged, visible now like those pebbles beneath clear water. David tells her about tossing stones, about letting the current take what we cannot change. "But there's no creek near me," she says, and he remembers being young, literal, needing exact instructions. "Grandma adapted," he says. During droughts, she used visualization. During winters, she dropped ice cubes in hot water, watched them melt. The practice shapes itself to our lives. He tells her about shower meditations, about releasing regrets down the drain, about the time Grandma blessed his garbage disposal, declaring it a mechanical stream for processing mental waste. They talk until dawn, 3 generations connected across pixels and time zones. His daughter promises to try the practice, to find her own stream. After they hang up, David sits in growing light, fountain still bubbling its endless circle. He thinks of his grandmother's final years, how dementia had taken her English but left her Buddhism intact. She'd forgotten their names but remembered to drop pebbles in her teacup, smiling as they clinked against ceramic. The month before she died, she'd grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "The stream," she'd whispered in Mandarin, a language he barely understood. "It goes to the ocean. All pebbles become sand. All sand becomes shore. Nothing lost." He'd nodded, pretending to understand, but only now, at 56, does meaning begin to surface. David stands, knees protesting the cold ground, and goes inside. In his home office, he finds a box of her things. Photos, immigration papers, a handful of smooth stones she'd collected over the years. Each one worn by water, transformed by time. He places them on his desk, these artifacts of a practice that predates apps and certificates. Opening his laptop, he begins to write. Not emails or reports, but stories. His grandmother's stories, his own stories, the stories that bridge old world and new. He writes about the creek that flows to the ocean, about the woman who carried Dharma in her bones, about the ways wisdom adapts and survives. The words flow like water, carrying away the sediment of regret. Later, he'll share these stories with his daughter, his mother, the cousins scattered across continents. He'll create a family archive of adapted Buddhism, folk wisdom preserved in pixels. But for now, he just writes, letting each word be a pebble dropped into the digital stream, trusting the current to carry them where they need to go. The fountain outside matches his typing rhythm, water and words cycling together. Somewhere, his grandmother's teachings flow through silicon valleys and fiber optic cables, ancient wisdom in contemporary vessels. The stream adapts but never stops flowing, carrying each generation's stones towards some vast, patient ocean. As the sun rises fully, David feels something release. Not dramatically, but gently, like a hand opening underwater. The regrets remain, but lighter now, worn smooth by attention and story. He saves the document, titles it simply Pebbles, and sends it to his daughter with a note, for when you can't sleep. The practice continues, shaped by new hands but essentially unchanged. A grandmother's love, a flowing stream, the willingness to let go. These constants persist across languages and lifetimes. David makes tea, jasmine this time, and raises the cup in a silent toast to the woman who taught him that Buddhism lives not in perfect pronunciation or proper postures, but in the space between holding on and letting go. The kitchen fills with morning light and memory. 3 generations of insomniacs learning to release their stones into the endless, patient stream. Nothing lost, everything transformed, the teaching flowing forward into whatever comes next. The tumor was my greatest teacher. 3 weeks left, the doctors say, and I find myself laughing softly at 3 a.m., watching moonlight paint silver squares across my monastery cell floor. 18,000 nights I've lived, and only now do I understand what all those sleepless souls really needed to hear. You see, tonight you met 5 of us, but we are truly one voice speaking through time, one understanding flowering in the darkness like night-blooming jasmine. I am Sage Aya, dying joyfully at 82, and I want to tell you about Matthew and his racing thoughts, about green tea cooling in ceramic cups, about the profound silence that lives between heartbeats. But first, let me share something beautiful. When you know your nights are numbered, each one becomes infinitely precious. The insomnia that plagued me for decades simply dissolved. Not because I conquered it, but because I finally understood what it was trying to teach. The monastery bell chimes once, a bronze note that hangs in the air like a question mark. 3 weeks ago, that sound would have startled me awake. Now it sings me deeper into stillness. This is what approaching death offers, the ultimate perspective on what truly matters. And tonight, dear soul lying awake somewhere in the darkness, what matters is that you understand how your story connects to every story, how your sleeplessness is actually a calling toward the deepest rest. Let me tell you about Matthew, 60 years old, sitting in his kitchen at 2 a.m. with thoughts circling like vultures. The ceramic mug warm between his palms, steam rising in delicate spirals, but his mind refuses the invitation to settle. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Matthew is all of us, every character you've met tonight, every person who has ever stared at ceiling shadows while the world sleeps peacefully around them. But here's what I've learned in these final weeks. Matthew's thoughts aren't the enemy. They're actually gateway guardians, protectors of a deeper truth that can only be accessed through genuine stillness. The Zen masters knew this. They understood that the racing mind is like a pot of muddy water, constantly stirred. The solution isn't to fight the mud or scream at the water. The solution is to simply stop stirring. I watch Matthew in my mind's eye, this beautiful composite of everyone struggling with sleep, everyone haunted by midlife regrets and lost purpose. He lifts the cup, and in that simple gesture lives everything we've explored tonight. Brian's garden wisdom, Elena's boardroom lessons about releasing control, Sarah's kitchen transformation of pain into nourishment, David's deep shadow integration in candlelit rooms, all of it spiraling into this one moment. Matthew choosing to truly taste his tea. The first sip is always the most honest. Before the mind has time to judge or analyze, there's just warmth and flavor and the small miracle of liquid becoming part of your body. Matthew pauses, surprised by the simplicity. His thoughts continue their dance, but something shifts in his relationship to them. Instead of fighting the mental chatter, he begins to listen for the spaces between thoughts, the way you might listen for silence between raindrops. This is the secret the dying know. Resistance is what keeps us awake. Not thoughts themselves, but our war against thoughts. Not feelings, but our exhausting battle to control feelings. Matthew discovers this as he takes his second sip, more slowly now. The tea tastes exactly the same, but he is different. The one who tastes has remembered how to receive rather than grasp. I remember my own decades of sleepless nights, before the tumor, before the diagnosis that paradoxically set me free. I would lie in my narrow monastery bed, mind churning with plans and regrets, spiritual achievements and failures. The harder I tried to meditate my way into sleep, the more elusive rest became. I was like a person trying to catch their own shadow, forever chasing something that was already connected to me. But watch Matthew now. He's not trying to empty his mind, that impossible task that has frustrated seekers for centuries. Instead, he's learning what the tea ceremony masters call ichigo ichi, one time, one meeting. This sip will never happen again. This breath is unrepeatable. This moment of sitting in a quiet kitchen while the world sleeps is absolutely unique in the entire history of the universe. The third sip brings tears to his eyes, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it's the recognition that he's been making everything so complicated when the answer was always this simple. Perhaps it's grief for all the peaceful moments he missed while struggling against what is. Or perhaps it's just the profound relief of finally stopping the exhausting effort to be somewhere else. You see, dear restless soul, Matthew represents the completion of a journey that began in Brian's garden. Remember Brian, discovering that his insomnia wasn't a problem to solve, but a doorway to tend. His mint plants taught him that some things grow better in darkness, that rest isn't the absence of activity, but a different kind of presence entirely. Matthew's racing thoughts are like those mint plants, actually quite vibrant and alive, requiring only gentle attention rather than eradication. The fourth sip connects Matthew to Elena in her corporate tower, learning that success isn't about controlling outcomes, but about showing up fully to whatever arises. His thoughts about work stress and financial worries don't disappear, but they lose their tyrannical power. They become weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness, interesting but not threatening. Elena's greatest lesson whispers through the steam rising from his cup. What if the goal isn't to have no thoughts, but to relate to thoughts with radical acceptance? Matthew finds himself smiling as he remembers Sarah's midnight cooking sessions, how she transformed her divorce grief into nourishing meals. The parallel is unmistakable. His insomnia is also raw material for transformation, not something to overcome, but something to compost into wisdom. The thoughts that keep him awake are like Sarah's onions, making him cry as they're chopped, but essential ingredients in the recipe for peace. The tea is cooling now, but Matthew doesn't rush. He's entered what the masters call tea mind, a state of such complete presence that time becomes elastic. This is what Sarah discovered in her kitchen sanctuary, that healing happens not through avoiding pain, but through changing our relationship to it. Matthew's sleeplessness has been his teacher all along, offering lessons in surrender he couldn't learn any other way. As the fifth sip settles into his belly, Matthew encounters David's shadow integration work. Those racing thoughts aren't random. They're his psyche's attempt to process undigested experiences, unacknowledged parts of himself. The business anxiety masks deeper fears about worthiness. The health worries carry ancient griefs about mortality. The relationship concerns hide profound longing for authentic connection. Instead of seeing his thoughts as intrusions, Matthew begins recognizing them as messengers from neglected parts of his soul. This is the alchemy David discovered in his candlelit room. What we resist persists, but what we welcome with curiosity can transform. Matthew's midnight mind isn't broken. It's incredibly intelligent, working overtime to integrate all the complexity of being human. The racing thoughts are actually an indication of psychological vitality, like a strong immune system that responds vigorously to threats. But here's the miracle unfolding in Matthew's kitchen, the same miracle I witnessed in my final months. When we stop fighting our experience and start befriending it, everything changes. Not because the external circumstances shift, but because the one who witnesses those circumstances remembers their true nature. Matthew isn't his thoughts any more than he is the cup in his hands. He's the aware presence in which thoughts and cups and late-night tea ceremonies arise and dissolve. The sixth sip brings profound quiet. Not the absence of thought, but a spaciousness that can hold any thought without disturbance. This is what I call deathbed consciousness, the ultimate perspective that comes when you truly understand the temporary nature of all phenomena. Matthew's job stress seems less solid suddenly, more like clouds drifting across an infinite sky. His racing mind reveals itself as another weather pattern, fascinating in its intensity, but not requiring his complete identification. I lean back against my pillows, feeling the morphine's gentle embrace, and smile at how long it took me to learn what Matthew is discovering right now. The tea ceremony isn't about the tea. It's about remembering how to meet each moment with fresh awareness, without the protective armor of preconception. His seventh sip tastes like awakening, like coming home to a self he'd forgotten existed beneath all the worry and striving. This is the great completion, beloved insomniac. All 5 voices you've heard tonight were preparing you for this moment of recognition. Brian's garden grew this understanding like summer tomatoes. Elena's boardroom refined it like corporate strategy. Sarah's kitchen seasoned it with tears and laughter. David's shadow work revealed its hidden depths. And now, in Matthew's quiet sip-by-sip meditation, the truth flowers fully. You are not your sleeplessness. You are the vast awareness in which sleeplessness appears. The 8th sip is prayer, though Matthew wouldn't name it that. It's gratitude for this simple moment, this unremarkable miracle of ceramic and liquid and conscious presence. He realizes he's been seeking some dramatic spiritual experience when the sacred was always hiding in plain sight, in the felt sense of being alive, awake, exactly where he is. This is what the dying know. Ordinary moments are shot through with grace if we have eyes to see. I think of all the souls I've counseled over the years, all the meditation students who came to the monastery seeking some special state of consciousness. They wanted enlightenment like a trophy to collect, permanent bliss like a spiritual achievement badge. But what I learned in my final chapter is much simpler and more beautiful. Awakening is just remembering how to be present with what's actually here, thoughts and all. Matthew takes his 9th sip like communion, recognizing the tea as part of an ancient conversation between human consciousness and the natural world. The leaves that became this brew grew slowly in mountain soil, were touched by countless raindrops, warmed by the same sun that will rise in a few hours. He's participating in a ceremony that connects him to every person who has ever found solace in a quiet cup, every seeker who discovered that the spiritual path isn't about transcending humanity, but about embracing it fully. This is why I'm dying with such inexplicable joy, dear friends. Not because death is good or life is bad, but because I finally understand that every experience, including insomnia, including illness, including the slow dissolution of everything I thought I was, is part of one vast, interconnected teaching. Matthew's sleepless nights have been preparing him for this moment of recognition, just as my cancer prepared me for the ultimate letting go. The 10th and final sip is barely a taste, more of a blessing on his lips. Matthew sits in the sacred silence that follows completion, feeling his thoughts settle like sediment in still water. Not gone, but no longer dominating his entire field of awareness. He's discovered what every wisdom tradition points toward: the eye of the hurricane, the still point around which all the mental activity revolves. As I prepare for my own final sleep, I want to share the practice that synthesizes everything Matthew learned, everything all 5 voices have offered tonight. Place your hands on your heart and feel the gentle rhythm that has accompanied you through every moment of your life. This heartbeat is your personal monastery bell, always available as an anchor for scattered attention. Now breathe in the memory of Brian's garden mint, that teaching about finding peace in darkness. Let your inhale carry the understanding that some things grow better without forcing. Exhale Elena's boardroom wisdom about releasing control, letting go of the exhausting effort to manage every thought and feeling. Breathe in Sarah's kitchen alchemy, the knowledge that pain can be transformed into nourishment. Exhale David's shadow integration, releasing the war against unwanted aspects of yourself. Finally, breathe in Matthew's tea ceremony, the profound simplicity of meeting each moment with fresh awareness. This breath, right now, will never happen again. This particular configuration of thoughts and feelings and sensations is absolutely unique. Instead of trying to escape your experience, what if you could meet it with the same presence Matthew brought to his cooling tea? As you settle into sleep, remember that you're not trying to achieve some special state. You're simply learning to rest in the natural awareness that you already are. The consciousness that watches thoughts come and go like weather patterns across an infinite sky. Your insomnia has been your teacher, offering lessons in surrender that could never be learned through ease alone. I close my eyes now, 3 weeks from my final breath, and feel nothing but gratitude for this wild, painful, beautiful journey of being human. Tomorrow night, you might lie awake again, thoughts spinning like prayer wheels in the darkness. When that happens, remember Matthew and his tea ceremony. Remember that you're not broken or wrong or spiritually inadequate. You're simply a conscious being learning how to be present with the full catastrophe of existence. The monastery grows quiet around me. 23 monks breathing in unison somewhere in the building's depths. But I hear something else in the silence. The sound of every insomniac finally coming home to themselves. The whisper of thoughts settling like autumn leaves. The gentle sigh of resistance transforming into acceptance. Sleep well, dear soul. You're exactly where you need to be, learning exactly what you need to learn. And if sleep doesn't come tonight, that's perfect too. You have everything you need to meet whatever arises with the same tender presence Matthew brought to his simple cup of tea. In the space between breaths, between thoughts, between heartbeats, may you discover the rest that surpasses understanding. May all beings find peace in the darkness, and may your sleepless nights bloom into the deepest awakening. The bell chimes once more, and I smile into the darkness, surrounded by the invisible presence of every soul who has ever struggled to sleep. Every person who discovered that the answer was always hiding in the question itself.